Hello, on this snowy April 12th, 2025, somewhere in Massachusetts. It's very unusual. In the 40 plus years that I've been in Massachusetts, I've never seen snow on April 12th. Um, so I'm speaking today on the eve of the anniversary of April 13th, 1975, which will fall tomorrow, Sunday, April 13th, 2025. Um, 50 years to the day. I do remember that Sunday, April 13th, 1975. I was 12 then. And yes, it was a Sunday. It was not a school day, unlike what some filmmakers reenacting the Eine Remene bus scene, the putative spark that lit the conflagration of what they then abusively began calling the Lebanese Civil War. So, unlike what certain filmmakers like us to think, April 13th, 1975 was not a school day, and they could not have possibly witnessed that spark from a window of their Lycée Abdelkader High School, which incidentally was in Sanaya, whereas that famous bus scene was in Ain Remene, which is quite a ways from Sanaya in East Beirut. Um, in any case, there's so much rancid ink and vile moral vomit has been spilled on April 13th, 1975. And not only on that day, but on what sparked it, what came before it, and all that has transpired in its aftermath, mainly about so called right wing reactionary Lebanese Christians assaulting unprovoked, beatific left wing progressive Palestinians and their Lebanese Muslim allies, paragons, we are told, of liberalism and secularism and human rights and the rest of it. A lot has been written on this, and essentially the stereotypes about the Lebanese so-called civil war and the stereotypes about the Christians, who incidentally are painted as the main actors and the provokers of this war. And I would highly, in this context, I would highly recommend reading on this history the likes of Jonathan Randall, Sandra Mackey, Robert Fisk, Fawaz Trabulsi, and Kamal Salibi, especially the House of Many Mansions. Highly recommended books, not only for their historical value, which admittedly they do have some historical value, but also they should be read or reread for their sheer viciousness and the ideological hackery emanating from their pens as authors who are avowed, unapologetic, venomous even doctrinaires who you will deduce from their texts were clearly writing with an ideological axe to grind. More than historians and journalists and authors, they do come across, let's give a fair reading, they do come across as ideological hacks, masquerading as dispassionate purveyors of fact or history and journalism. However, to the above, I would also recommend a companion reading, or a number of companion readings, namely Theodore Hanf's Coexistence in Wartime Lebanon, Bill Harris's The Faces of Lebanon, Marius Deeb's The Lebanese Civil War, and his more recent Syria's terrorist war on Lebanon, with a foreword by Fouad Ajami, a brilliant foreword that I would highly recommend. And I would also highly recommend a shorter text, but an obligatory text by Bernard Lewis, titled "Right and Left in Lebanon." I think it's an amazing essay, and in it, in trademark Lewis literary charm, in the span of 3,000 words, he shatters all the times inanities about so-called right-wing fascist reactionary Lebanese Christian militias wreaking havoc on innocent, progressive, pacifist, secular PLO Boy Scouts and their flower power Lebanese Muslim members of the Salvation Army. But should you wish to read only one book or two books perhaps, I highly recommend Thierry Desjardins' Le Martyr du Liban, the Sacrifice of Lebanon, and Jean-Pierre Peroncel-Hugo's Une croix sur le Liban, Xing out Lebanon. Jean-Pierre Peroncel Hugo's was then still a young correspondent of Le Monde when he began filing stories from Lebanon. Le Monde, you have to keep in mind that at the time, in the 1970s, back then, it was long before it had become France's version of Pravda. But JPPH, Jean-Pierre Peroncel Hugo's, was also, unlike the bulk of the journalists who were writing on Lebanon and essentially being fed stories by the PLO, Jean-Pierre Peroncel Hugo's was a gifted Arabist. He spoke fluent Egyptian Arabic. He read and write modern standard Arabic fluently. And he was one of the few, you can number them on the fingers of one hand, one of the few Western correspondents who refused to file their stories from the Hotel Commodore in West Beirut, which was then a PLO central where Western and Arab journalists lived, essentially, and drafted what JPPH called their journalistic crimes, essentially feeding the world stories fed them not by fact, not by what was happening on the ground, but stories that were fed them by the PLO, their hosts, and PLO propaganda. JPPH was, in fact, the first Western journalist to dare call out the PLO for the crimes they were committing in Lebanon and against the Lebanese, both Muslims and Christians who refused to submit to the PLO's diktats, describing what had been written on October 13th, 1975 as, in his words, un crime médiatique, a media-concocted crime, an anti-Lebanese Christian libel that was eventually aped and intellectualized by complicit academics and authors like the ones I mentioned earlier, Fisk, Randall, and the other demagogues who essentially etched in stone, so to speak, all the prevalent stereotypes about Lebanon that still dominate knowledge about Lebanon and Lebanon Christians to this very day. So, in summation, no, April 13th, 1975 was not the valiant PLO and so-called Lebanese Muslim leftists rising against fascist, reactionary Lebanese Christians. To the contrary, it was the Lebanese Christians taking up weapons, and at the time taking up in the main hunting rifles or whatever they could muster from their private homes in order to defend their state against the PLO's arrogant abuses. And when the Lebanese state and the Lebanese National Army were essentially emasculated by Arab brethren and prevented from reining in armed Palestinians' violations of Lebanese sovereignty. So that's my take on this 50th anniversary of Sunday, April 13th, 1975. Have a nice Palm Sunday tomorrow.